In section 3.2, we're going to talk about compound statements. Now in section 3.1, we were only looking at what we call simple statements. So a simple statement just has one idea. It does not have what we call connectives. So now we're going to look at compound statements. A compound statement will have more than one simple statement, so more than one idea, and it's going to contain connectives. So when we talk about connectives, these are words or phrases that will join simple statements together. And we're going to look at 4 connectives: and, or, if then, if and only if. For example, let's say that I have these 3 simple statements. You're wealthy. You're well educated. You'll be happy. Each one of these conveys one idea, and none of them have connectives. However, I can connect them. So let's look at this first statement. If you're wealthy or you're well educated, then you'll be happy. I have the connective if, then, and I also see or. And when I look at the statements that are left over, or you could look at them as between or on either side of the connectives, then these would be my simple statements. You're wealthy, you're well educated, you'll be happy. So if you're given a compound statement in English words, what you want to do is you want to look at where the connectives are, ignore them, and look at what's left over. And that should be your simple statements. Now, they might not be complete simple statements. So for example, if I were to take this statement and play around with it a little bit using my English grammar rules, I can also write, if you're wealthy or well educated, you'll be happy. And these mean the same thing. So notice that this second your, grammatically, I don't need it. I don't need to repeat that. So I can look at if you're wealthy or well educated. Also in if then, sometimes you will not see then written. It's implied. So if you're wealthy or well educated, you'll be happy has an implied then. Again, the English language, there's many, many ways to say the same thing. Symbolically, if I were to call P, you're wealthy, Q, you're well educated, and R, you'll be happy, notice that this statement would be P or Q, then R. Now I rewrote this using my grammar rules, but my simple statements are still P, Q, R, written in the same order. Let's look at all 4 connectives. Let's start with our conjunction, which is and. So whenever you see and, that's our conjunction. Symbolically, it's this caret symbol on your keyboard, often called the hat symbol, which looks like a capital A without the bar. Example 1, we have 2 simple statements. P, it is dark outside. Q, they are jogging. Now I want to take the following statements and express them symbolically. They are jogging and it is dark outside. It is not dark outside and they are jogging. So part A, the first thing I want to do is I want to locate my connective. I see and, oops, I see an and. So that tells me that my simple statement should be on either side of this and that's connecting my 2 statements. They are jogging. Is that in my list? And yes, they are jogging is Q. So I'm going to replace they are jogging with Q. I'm going to replace the connective and with our symbol. It is dark outside. That would be P. So symbolically, Q and P. In part B, it is not dark outside and they are jogging. I see my connective and. So I'm going to look on either side of the and see if these simple statements match up to what was given to me. It is not dark outside. Notice that there's a not here. So P, it is dark outside. It is not dark outside would be not P, and they are jogging is Q. In the following table, there are some expressions for and. Again, remember, many ways to say the same thing. So if we look at our statement P and Q, that symbol for our conjunction and can be just the word and. But there are other words that we can use besides and. So let's say that P is, it is after 5 p.m., Q is, they are working. So P and Q, it is after 5 p.m. and they are working. However, I could also use the word but instead of and I would have the same meaning. Now remember, symbolically, these are all going to be represented the same way. This is P and Q. With the word but, it's still P and Q. And in fact, for all of these, it's P and Q symbolically. However, the word and can be replaced with other words, but symbolically, still all the same, which is why I keep saying, and I'm going to say this over and over again, once we're in symbolic form, everything is simple. It's a little bit more complicated when we're in words. So let's look at but. It is after 5 p.m., but they are working. Same meaning. Yet. It is after 5 p.m., yet they are still working. Again, same meaning, different word, symbolically, still P and Q. A word that I don't use that often, nevertheless, still same meaning. It is after 5 p.m., nevertheless, they are working. So all of these symbolically are exactly the same. However, the word and, but, yet, nevertheless, they differ. I did have a caution though. Just because you see and, it does not always indicate a conjunction. So how can you tell? Well, if the and is a conjunction, then if you separate the two pieces, then the meaning should not change. So in this first statement, nonviolence and truth are inseparable. That says that you cannot separate nonviolence and truth. They go together. However, if I were to grammatically treat this as if it were a conjunction and separate it into nonviolence is inseparable and truth is inseparable, then my statement changed meaning. The second statement says you cannot separate nonviolence into pieces, and you cannot separate truth into pieces, which is not what the first one says. The first one says that nonviolence and truth, they go together. You cannot separate those two from each other. So if it's a conjunctive and, then if you do break it up into two pieces using our grammar rules, then the meaning should not change. For example, fruits and vegetables are healthy. This says the same thing as fruits are healthy and vegetables are healthy. That is a conjunctive and. So the first statement is not a conjunctive and. So this is not a conjunction. And the second example is a conjunction. The next connective we're going to look at is our disjunction, which would be the or, and the symbol is opposite that of a conjunction. So it looks like a V. When we talk about or, there's two ways that we can look at an or statement. In this example, I visited Boston or New York. It is an or statement. So there's two ways I can look at this or. The first way, I visited Boston or I visited New York, but not both. That's what we call an exclusive or. It excludes the possibility that both could happen. The second way that we look at an or is I visited Boston or I visited New York or I visited both. That's what we call an inclusive or. It includes the possibility that both could happen. In logic, and in fact in mathematics in general, we always use an inclusive or. We do not use the exclusive or, which means whenever you have an or statement, it includes the possibility that both could happen. Remember, all legal documents are logical statements. So whenever you're reading a legal document, the or is always going to be an inclusive or, unless stated otherwise. Let's look at example 2. P, you earn your AA degree. Q, you satisfy the math requirement. We're going to express the following statement symbolically. Part A, you earn your AA degree or you satisfy the math requirement. Now again, we look for our connective. In this case, it's an or. And then we look to either side of our connective to see if we can identify those statements. You earn your AA degree is P, or you satisfy the math requirement, that would be Q. Part B, you satisfy the math requirement or you do not earn your AA degree. I see my or. I look to either side of my or. You satisfy the math requirement, that would be Q. Or, hey, I just noticed I had an or, but I wrote an and. So whenever I make a mistake in my videos, I do not edit it out. I leave it in because I am human. So you satisfy the math requirement is Q, or you do not earn your AA degree. So I have you earn your AA degree is P, so you do not earn your AA degree would be not P. So Q or not P. The third connective is our conditional statement, which would be our if-then. The conditional if-then is an arrow symbolically. This is the most important connective in logic. This is what every argument is. Every argument. Now remember, the goal of this chapter is to be able to determine if arguments are valid or invalid. Every argument is a conditional statement. So conditional statements are formed by looking at the quantified statement all. So all poets are writers can be written as the conditional statement. If a person is a poet, then that person is a writer. Let's just say that P is a person is a poet and Q is a person is a writer. So symbolically, I can write that as if P, then Q, or P arrow Q. The first part, now this is an arrow going in one direction. And it's important to note that in a conditional statement, order matters. And in fact, this is the only connective where the order matters. When we look at our other three connectives, the order doesn't matter. In an or an and, if you change the order of your simple statements, the meaning does not change. And that's why we call the first part the antecedent. Ante meaning before, it has to come first. The second part after the arrow is the consequent. It's our consequence. So our goal is to be able to take arguments and write them as conditional statements, where our consequent will become our conclusion to our argument. The antecedent will be all our reasons why we support our conclusion. So let's go to number 3. P is a person is a singer, Q is a person is a dancer. We're going to express the following statements symbolically. A, if a person is not a dancer, then that person is not a singer. First thing I notice, if then. Looking on either side, a person is not a dancer, that person is not a singer. Now, something I want to bring up is that plurals, pronouns, that kind of stuff does not matter. So notice a person is not a dancer, that person is not a singer. A, that, she, he doesn't matter. Symbolically, it'll be the same, which is nice. So a person is not a dancer, I have a not in here, would be not Q. And since it's an if then, I would have the arrow. So remember, a person is not a dancer, that's our if portion, it comes first. Then is where the arrow goes. That person is not a singer, so I have a not in there. This would be not P. So if not Q, then not P. Let's look at part B. If a person is a singer, then that person is not a dancer. I see an if, then. I look on either side. A person is a singer. That person is not a dancer. A person is a singer would be P, arrow. That person is not a dancer would be not Q. In this table, we have some other ways that you could see an if-then statement. So remember, symbolically, every one of these examples would be a P arrow Q, or if P, then Q. Let's say P is a person is a father and Q is a person is a male. If P, then Q, if a person is a father, then that person is a male, would be the same as if I change the order and I just put an if between them. So Q if P. A person is a male if that person is a father. Now those two statements, if a person is a father, then that person is a male, a person is a male, if that person is a father, they mean the same thing. So again, you want to look at this table as a template. When you are translating conditional statements from words to symbols, remember there's going to be a variety of ways that you could say them. And in a conditional statement, order always matters. So other ways that are not so common would be this next one. P is sufficient for Q. Being a father is sufficient for being a male. When you see sufficient, the order is still the same. Symbolically, this is still P arrow Q. However, if I use the word necessary, Q is necessary for P, being a male is necessary for being a father. Necessary means change the order around. So if it's a Q is necessary for P, I would switch the order. Symbolically, this would be P arrow Q. Remember, these are all P arrow Q. So being a male is necessary for being a father means that what comes after necessary is actually going to come first. The necessary would be my arrow, and being a male was Q. So again, confusing. Don't have to memorize it. Just look at the table. So another way that we can write a conditional statement would be P only if Q. A person is a father only if that person is a male. Again, that's still P arrow Q. That still has the same meaning as if P then Q. Look at this last one. Only if Q, comma, P. So notice that we took the previous statement and we just reorganized it. Only if Q, comma, P. Only if a person is a male is that person a father. So if the only if comes at the beginning of the statement, then that means what follows is going to switch order. So person is a male was Q, person is a father is P, right? This was Q, this was P. But since I had an only if in front of it, it still switched the order, P arrow Q. Can get confusing, and that's because there's many ways to say the same thing in the English language, but symbolically these are all exactly the same. Let's look at example 4. P, we owe money. Q, we control our spending. We're going to express the following statement symbolically. Owing money is necessary for not controlling our spending. So the first thing I see is my connective. Going back to our table, is necessary for. Ooh, that one's loud. Is necessary for. On either side, owing money, not controlling our spending. Okay, let me bring those statements. Owing money, we owe money, symbolically the same. This is P. Oh, I didn't want red. Oh well, now it's red. Is necessary for. I'll let that stay. Not controlling our spending, there's a not in there. So not controlling our spending is not Q. So the thing is it going to stay in the same order? Is it going to be P arrow not Q? Going back to the table, is necessary for means you switch the orders. If P came first, is necessary for means I'm going to switch and P is going to come last. So this would actually be if not Q, then P. So if not Q, then P. Our last connective that we're going to talk about is the if and only if. That would be our biconditional. If and only if. It's a double arrow. And what a biconditional does is exactly what it sounds like. Bi is to, we saw the conditional statement, the if then. So biconditional just puts two conditionals together. So we'll look at this example. P is going to be a person as a father. And Q is going to be a person is a male. We can form a biconditional. A person is a father if and only if a person is a male. And you can think about the biconditional as sort of an equal sign. If a biconditional is true, what's on both sides of the biconditionals, if and only if, they'll be the same. So here I have my if, I have my if and only if. On one side I have a person is a father, a person is a male. So that would be P, if and only if Q. I can write this in a longer form using the two conditional statements. So notice another way I could say that statement, and I can replace my if and only if with two conditionals. I could say, if a person is a father, then that person is a male, and if a person is a male, then that person is a father. So when I look at the first part, if a person is a father, then that person is a male. Okay, so father was P. That would be P. Oops, keep doing that. That would be P arrow Q. And this would be Q arrow P. So it takes these two conditional statements in different order, puts them together into one biconditional statement. Let's do some examples. Example 5, P, the word is go. Q, the word has 368 meanings. So we're going to express the following statement symbolically. The word has 368 meanings if and only if the word is go. My connective, if and only if, on either side. The word has 368 meanings. The word is go. So the word has 368 meanings. That would be my Q. If and only if the word is go is P. And notice if I changed this around and said the word is go if and only if the word has 368 meanings, that statement would still be the same. Again, meaning-wise, order really doesn't matter in a biconditional. Part B, the word is not go if and only if the word does not have 368 meanings. So the word is not go. That would be my not P. If and only if the word does not have 368 meanings, so I have a does not in there. That would be my not Q. And again, we have another table of other ways we can say if and only if. Again, symbolically, it's all going to be P, that double arrow, Q. So let's say P would be a person is an unmarried male. Q, a person is a bachelor. Notice that P and Q are the exact same thing. An unmarried male is a bachelor. So we saw the if and only if. P, if and only if Q. A person is an unmarried male if and only if a person is a bachelor. If I change the order, Q, if and only if P, a person is a bachelor, if and only if a person is an unmarried male, means the same thing. I could break this up into two conditional statements, if P then Q, and if Q then P. If a person is an unmarried male, then that person is a bachelor. And if a person is a bachelor, then that person is an unmarried male. Says the same thing. Now we're going to do the necessary sufficient. So P is necessary and sufficient for Q. Being an unmarried male is necessary and sufficient for being a bachelor. Still, when you see necessary and sufficient, still going to be P if and only if Q. Same meaning. What if I were to change around necessary and sufficient? What if I had Q is necessary and sufficient for P? Same thing. Being a bachelor is necessary and sufficient for being an unmarried male? It doesn't matter. Still can use P double arrow Q. You can also use Q double arrow P. The order doesn't matter in a biconditional. So what's nice about necessary and sufficient is in a biconditional, doesn't matter. You do have to be careful with the word necessary and the word sufficient when you're dealing with a conditional, but not a biconditional. The next thing we're going to talk about is parentheses and commas. Some of our statements, especially our compound statements, can get very long. So oftentimes we'll use commas to break up our statement in words. And then oftentimes that will translate symbolically to parentheses. For example, let's say that P is he earns $15,000 yearly. Q is he is often sad. Now remember, he, pronoun he, does not matter. I could say we, thee, they, a person. Symbolically, it would be the same. So we're going to write each of these symbolic statements in words. Notice that in part A and B, the order is exactly the same. The only thing I've done is in part A, I have parentheses. In part B, I don't. So what we're going to do is we're going to see how we can translate using those parentheses. In the first statement A, the negation is on the outside of the parentheses. So the negation on the outside of the parentheses says that that negation applies to everything that follows. But in part B, the negation is only to the statement Q. So when you see a negation on the outside of the parentheses, the easiest thing to do grammatically is to replace that negation with, it is not true that. So that would be this negation. What follows will be negated. The whole thing will be negated. So Q and P. He is often sad and he earns 15,000 yearly. So he is often sad Did I just write sand? He is often sad. And he earns $15,000 yearly, but I could just write that as he is often sad and earns $15,000 yearly. Or it is not the case that. Okay? The difference between part A and part B is in part B, the negation only applies to Q. So that means I'm going to directly negate Q. He is often sad will be he is not often sad, right? And I have that and there. Oops. He earns $15,000 yearly. So he is not often sad and he earns $15,000 yearly. When you look at these two statements and you look at their meaning, they don't mean the same thing. So you do have to be careful with your use of parentheses, okay? Especially if there's a negation on the outside. So whenever you have more than two connectives, which would be 3 or more letters, you're required to group. So grouping symbols are required, and that would be parentheses, or we could use brackets or those curly parentheses we'll see later. Grouping symbols are required with 2 or more connectives, 3 or more letters. In this table, you see that I have P and not Q, arrow not R. The difference between the two is in the first example, I've used parentheses to group the first 2 statements. In the second example, I've used parentheses to group the last 2 statements. Notice that I have 2 connectives, 3 letters. I need grouping symbols. And in this case, the grouping symbols that I'm using are parentheses. In the first case, I'm grouping together P and not Q. This is a conditional statement where the if portion would be the first part in parentheses. So this would read if P and not Q. And since that's grouped together, what we've done is we've added this comma in the English language to indicate grouping or parentheses. What follows would be the then not R. Let's say that I was to group together the not Q, arrow not R. So I've changed my parentheses. So notice this is now an and statement. So this would be P, and there's a comma here to indicate that I'm going to have another grouping. So P and if not Q, then not R. So they read differently depending on where the parentheses are. Now it'd be nice if I could move this comma to after the and to indicate that that's where my parentheses would start. Ooh, loud rooster. However, this is the English language and we do not put the comma after the and, we put the comma before the and. Okay. So again, in the English language, if you see commas, that does indicate grouping. But in this case, you would group after the and when adding in your parentheses. For example, let's look at example 7. We have 3 simple statements. P is the milk is refrigerated. Q, the milk is cold. R, the milk is sour. We're going to write each symbolic statement in words. Now notice that in part A and B, the symbolic statements are exactly the same. The only thing I've done is change my grouping symbol. I've changed my parentheses. So in part A, this is an if-then statement where the if would be P and not Q. Then would be the R. So P and not Q. P, the milk is refrigerated, and not Q, the milk is not cold. So the milk is refrigerated and the milk is not cold. That's my if. So if the milk is refrigerated and not Q would be the milk is not cold, or you could just write and not cold, but I'll just do a direct translation of and the milk is not cold. Since that's where my parentheses are, then I'm going to put a comma to indicate that they're grouped together. If the milk is refrigerated and the milk is not cold, then not R, the milk is not sour. Then the milk is not sour. Again, you could write that in a different way using different words and it would have the same meaning. So if the milk is refrigerated and not cold, comma, the milk is not sour, I could kind of rearrange it, but you do want to be careful I have a direct translation from symbols to words, and it's fine. Oftentimes on my math lab, you'll find that it's a direct translation. Other times, they'll kind of clean it up a little bit, maybe change the words around, same meaning, different words. In part B, P and, parentheses around the not Q, arrow not R, so that's grouped together. So P, that was the milk is refrigerated. And, but remember that the comma goes before the and in the English language, and. So now translating what's in the parentheses, if not Q, then not R. So notice that in this case, the if and the then are in different places in this statement. And if not Q, the milk is not cold. Then not R would be the milk is not sour. I've done a direct translation from the symbols to the word. The milk is refrigerated, and if the milk is not cold, then the milk is not sour. Okay? So notice that the if then is in a different place because of my grouping. So sometimes you will get statements in symbolic form where there are two or more connectives and you have to add in the parentheses. They're actually not given to you, which is the question, what if there are no parentheses? You have to add them in yourself by using what we call dominance of connectives. So the most dominant connective is a biconditional. So I'm going to call that number 1 because it's the most dominant. Remember, that's your double arrow. Next dominant would be the conditional, the arrow. And then the third most dominant connectives would be the conjunction. So that would be your and your disjunction, your or. I prefer to list the most dominant as my number 1 because it's a priority. However, I would like to just point out that your textbook is misleading. So if we look at this box here, this is what you'll find in your textbook on your My Lab. Their dominance of connectives for when it's not correct. They list number 1 as negation. A negation is not a connective. It does not connect two simple statements together. So there's an error in your book. Negation, not a connective. And also notice that the most dominant, which is the biconditional, and they say that the biconditional is the most dominant, they label that as 4. So in their eyes, the higher the number, the more dominant the connective, but that doesn't make sense to me because whenever you make a list and you're prioritizing, the first item on the list should be the most important, which is why, going back to my list, I list number 1 as a biconditional, it's most dominant, 2 conditional, 3 conjunction and disjunction, they have the same weight. Right? They're both kind of the same as far as dominance goes. Okay, so this is just my preference. Again, the negation shouldn't even be there. Let's go ahead and clarify our statements. So notice in this table, we have a bunch of symbolic statements, but there's no grouping symbols. So in the first one, we have P, arrow, Q, and not R. I am going to clarify this statement by using parentheses to group. So what I do is I look at my list of dominant connectives. Now the biconditional, the double arrow, is most dominant. I don't see a biconditional in this statement. So then I look at the next dominant, which would be the conditional. And I see that there is a conditional. So this is what it means. It means that the dominant connective, the arrow, is going to break up. So let's do that. Break up your statement into two pieces. Dominant connective splits it into two pieces. And that's where your grouping is, on either side of the dominant connective. Notice that if you look at the left-hand side, that P, it's just one statement, so I really don't need the parentheses. So the clarification would be P arrow, and then parentheses around Q and not R. So the dominant connective is the type of statement it is. The dominant connective is the conditional. So this is a conditional statement. In mathematics, whenever you see parentheses, that means you're going to do that first. Kind of the same thing here. The last thing you're going to look at is that arrow, that conditional, which means it's a conditional statement. Let's look at the next row. We have P and Q if and only if, not R. So I have two connectives. I need to add my parentheses, my grouping symbol. I'm going to use dominance of connectives. And I see that I have the double arrow, the biconditional, which is dominant. And it's going to break this statement up into two pieces on either side of the dominant connective. On the left-hand side, I have P and Q. My biconditional, not R. Not R is just one statement. Remember, a negation is not a connective, so I don't need the parentheses around the not R. And this would be a biconditional. Third row down, P if and only if Q, arrow not R, so if P, if and only if Q. No, that sounds weird. So what I need to do is I need to add in my grouping symbols. Dominant connective, I see the double arrow, the biconditional. So I'm going to break this up on either side. I like the red better. And I note that P doesn't need the parentheses. Double arrow, parentheses around if Q, then not R. So this is a biconditional. All right, fourth row down. They're getting a little bit crazier. Okay, so I have an or, I have an if then. So dominant connectives would be the arrow. Break this up into two pieces. And then I would have parentheses around P and not Q. My if then, my arrow, parentheses around R or S. The dominant connective is a conditional, so this is a conditional statement. Okay, I have a problem with the next one, P and Q or R, because the and the or, they're equal in weight. Neither is dominant over the other. So I don't know what this is. I cannot clarify it. This is the case where it's ambiguous. So I don't know what kind of statement this is. Is it an and statement? Is it an or statement? Don't know. Okay, let's get crazy on this last one. Let's see, I have a lot of connectives, but what I do see is a biconditional, which is dominant. So where that double arrow is, I'm going to break this up into two pieces. The problem I have is within the first set of parentheses, I have three connectives. So I'm going to ignore the not R, and I'm going to look at this first piece. I'm going to have to add in more grouping symbols. So I see an or, and an if-then. The if-then is dominant, which means I'm going to break up within the parentheses around that dominant connective. So oftentimes if we have parentheses inside parentheses, we'll clarify that by having the innermost be parentheses and the outer be what we call brackets. So I'm going to put a bracket, and I'm going to keep the parentheses around P and not Q, and then parentheses around R or S, and then put in brackets. Are biconditional, and then the not R does not need parentheses around it. Now, it wouldn't be wrong if you added parentheses around the not R. It just is unnecessary. So dominant connective is a biconditional. This is a biconditional statement. So they can get a little crazy. Just take it in small steps. Go by dominance of connectives. So we're going to, in example 8, is we're going to write our compound statements in symbolic form. We're given statements in words, but notice that they're kind of the same statement. At least it has the same simple statements, but there is no comma in the first one, part A. There's a comma in part B. So in part A, I might have to add my own parentheses to indicate grouping. But part B, there's a comma there, so it's telling me where the grouping is. When you're given a compound statement in words and you want to write it in symbolic form, the first thing you want to do is you want to identify where your connectives are. Your and, your or, the if, then, if, and only if. You want to label your simple statements. And look for commas, which would indicate that there's some sort of grouping. If you don't have commas, then you're going to have to go to your dominant connectives. For example, in A, it says, if it is raining or the current is strong, then I will not go swimming. So I see an if, I see a then, I see an or. So if I look on either side of all those connectives, I have it is raining. I'm going to call that P. It is raining. And then Q. Okay, there's no commas in here. So I have an it is raining or the current is strong. That could be my Q. The current is strong. And then I have I will not go swimming. Okay, so when you're identifying your simple statements, what you want to do is ignore any negation. And instead, I'm going to have R be I will go swimming. Okay. So I've identified my connectives, I've labeled my simple statements. I'm going to look to commas. There are no commas in part A. So I'm going to directly translate it into symbols. I have it is raining or the current is strong. That would be if it is raining or Q, the current is strong, then I will not R. I will not go swimming. And this is an or, and this is an if then. So by dominant connectives, since there's no commas, I have to group together the P or Q. Okay? So this would be P or Q in parentheses, arrow, not R. All right, let's look at B. In part B, it is raining. There's a comma there, or if the current is strong, then I will not go swimming. I have an or, but I also have an if then. So the it is raining, that would be my P, or, but there's a comma there. So that tells me that this comma is going to group if the current is strong. That would be Q. Arrow, then I will not go swimming would be not R. So notice that in part A and part B, it's P or Q arrow, not R. They have the same symbolic representation, but in part B, I have a comma, which tells me that the Q arrow, not R, is grouped together. So this would be P or Q arrow, not R. Okay, so that's it for this section. The next section, we're finally going to be talking about whether statements are true or false.